Imagine finally moving into your dream apartment. You've got the new furniture, maybe some fresh paint on the walls, and that sense of security you get, especially in a building with a security guard on duty. But what if that guard, the one there to protect you, turns out to be the biggest threat?
That's a scary thought.
It is. And that's the terrifying reality behind the case of Sasha Samsidine.
It really is a disturbing case.
You sent over an episode of the Crime Junkie podcast about it. And well, today our mission is to unpack the details of what happened.
Sounds good.
Let's start by getting to know Sasha Samsidine. She was 27 years old, living in Orlando, Florida. She was helping people find their dream homes for a living, and she had just moved into what she thought was her dream apartment.
That's a key detail that she just moved in. It adds another layer to this whole thing. The fact that she wouldn't have had time to make enemies in her new building, it makes you think that she should have been safe there.
Absolutely. Her friends described her as someone who was always smiling, loved social media, and going out. So when she went missing after a night out with friends, everyone knew something was wrong.
Her friends' immediate concern really tells you something. They knew her well enough to know that her disappearing like that was totally out of character.
Exactly. Her friend Anthony was supposed to meet her for breakfast the morning after they went out.
Oh, so they'd been out together.
Yeah, they'd gone to an Orlando City soccer match and then to a nightclub called The Attic. When she didn't show up or answer her phone, Anthony knew something was off.
I can understand why he'd be worried, but what really makes this concerning is that she hadn't been active on social media at all that day.
Right. She was usually all over social media, so that was a big red flag.
Definitely. Along with missing breakfast, it's not a good sign.
Anthony called her close friends, Katie and Megan. And when they hadn't heard from her either, they knew they had to check on her.
It really says something that they decided to physically go to her apartment. It wasn't just that they couldn't reach her for a few hours. It was clearly something much more serious than that.
Yeah, they were really worried. They got to Sasha's apartment complex and saw her car in the parking garage. But when they noticed a gift in the back seat, their relief turned to dread.
Oh, wow. So she was supposed to go somewhere.
Yeah, that gift was for a baby shower Sasha was going to that day. The fact that she missed it really amplified their fear.
That makes sense.
They knocked on her door, but there was no answer. At that point, they knew they had to call the police.
Absolutely. It was a situation that was way beyond what they could handle.
Right. The police arrived at Sasha's apartment around 8:00 that evening.
Okay, so it was getting pretty late.
Her friends told the officers about Sasha's night out. They told them that she left the attic around 12:30 a.m.
So presumably she was heading home?
Right. Her apartment was less than a mile from the club, so they hadn't been too worried about her getting home safely.
That short distance almost gives you a false sense of security, like nothing could happen to her on such a short trip home, but that's not always the case.
It's true. And it's a chilling reminder that danger can be anywhere. The police were obviously concerned, so they decided to get into her apartment with the help of the apartment complex staff.
Getting into the apartment was important. It let the police see what the situation was and maybe find some clues.
When they opened the door, everything seemed normal. The lights were on the living room, and bedroom were tidy, and the bathroom looked clean.
That initial sense of normalcy is something you see at lots of crime scenes. There's this deceptive calm that can actually make the investigation harder because it doesn't immediately make you suspicious.
It's like a mask hiding something much darker underneath. But as the officers looked around, they noticed a few things that were off. The toilet seat was up, which seemed strange for a young woman's apartment.
Little things like that are what investigators call a red flag. They're small inconsistencies that often hint at something more sinister.
And it wasn't just the toilet seat. They also noticed a strong chemical smell, like bleach in the air. And in the bedroom, Sasha's comforter was rolled up in an unusual way.
Each of those details might not seem alarming on their own, but together they create this uneasy feeling like something isn't right.
Exactly. And as an officer was about to clear the bedroom, he saw something terrifying. Dark hair and a hand peeking out from that rolled-up comforter.
At that point, the investigation changes completely. What might have seemed like a missing person case quickly becomes much more serious.
It must have been a horrible realization that they were looking at a crime scene. The officer saw that it was Sasha, and she wasn't moving. Her arm was bent at an unnatural angle behind her back, and there were marks on her neck that looked like strangulation marks.
So right away, the crime scene suggests foul play. The way her body was positioned and the marks on her neck point to a possible homicide.
It must have been devastating for her friends waiting outside, hoping for the best, only to be met with that horrific news.
Absolutely. Their worst fears had come true. And now they're dealing with the unimaginable grief of losing their friend in such a horrible way.
It's truly heartbreaking. As crime scene technicians started working in the apartment, the question became, how did the killer get inside?
In any investigation, figuring out how someone got in is crucial. It helps you understand their plan and their potential connection to the victim.
Remember, Sasha's apartment was locked. And it wasn't a simple lock you could pick. It had a keypad entry system. And being on the third floor, it seemed unlikely someone would have come in through a window.
That secure entry system adds a whole other layer of mystery. It suggests the killer either had a key, knew the code, or somehow got past the security system.
So while the police are trying to figure out how someone got in, they were also looking for any evidence the killer might have left behind. The bathroom, especially the toilet and the open cabinets under the sink, seemed like obvious places to find fingerprints.
Fingerprints are often crucial for connecting a suspect to a crime scene. They're like a silent witness leaving behind a trace of the person who was there.
And they were right. They found a fingerprint on the toilet lid and several other prints in the apartment, including one next to Sasha's bed. They also found shoe prints around the apartment.
Multiple fingerprints and shoe prints suggest that the killer might have moved around the apartment freely, maybe even indicating they knew the place.
When they unrolled Sasha from the comforter, the brutality of her murder became even more apparent.
This is where even experienced investigators can be shaken. It's a stark reminder of the real human cost of this kind of violence.
Her shirt and bra were ripped open, and she wasn't wearing anything from the waist down. That chemical smell was coming from both the comforter and Sasha's body. The killer had poured chemicals, probably bleach, directly on her genitals.
Using bleach is a pretty big deal. It tells us the killer was probably trying to destroy evidence, possibly DNA. This shows a level of planning and maybe even an understanding of forensics.
It's a scary thought. The autopsy report later showed just how awful her death really was. It confirmed that she was strangled, but the medical examiner said he'd never seen a neck fracture as severe as Sasha's.
The severity of that neck fracture and the fact that bleach was used points to someone filled with rage, maybe even a desire for power and control.
She also had bruising on her arms, chest, and thighs. And there were defensive wounds showing that she fought back against her attacker.
So she didn't go down without a fight?
No, she didn't.
Yeah.
And though the medical examiner couldn't say for sure if she was sexually assaulted because of the bleach, the nature of the attack strongly suggests that was the motive.
That's a tragic example of how forensic evidence can be compromised. But even with the bleach, her other injuries and the context of the scene point to a sexual motive.
While they were processing the crime scene, the police started figuring out what Sasha was doing in the hours before her death. Luckily, her apartment complex had a security guard on duty at night and cameras covering all the entrances and exits.
Having those security cameras is a good thing in these cases. The footage can be crucial evidence showing timelines, possible suspects, and details that witnesses might have missed.
The only problem was that they couldn't see the footage right away. It was stored somewhere else, and it would take some time to get it. So while they waited, the police interviewed the security guard who was working that night, a 33-year-old named Stephen Dewberry.
So the security guard being the last person who might have seen Sasha alive becomes really important. What he says about that night could either support or contradict the other evidence.
Right. He was a key piece of the puzzle. The police talked to Stephen to try to figure out what he saw that night. And he told them that he remembered seeing Sasha when she came back to the complex.
Okay, so he puts himself right in the timeline.
He claimed that Sasha didn't have her key fob to get into the building, and that she couldn't use the call box because she didn't have her cell phone with her.
That missing cell phone matches up with the fact that it wasn't found in her apartment. It makes it seem like she maybe lost it or left it somewhere before even getting home.
Yeah. He said she was really drunk, and she couldn't prove who she was or that she lived there. So he told her he couldn't let her in, but while he was distracted, she slipped into the building behind someone else.
So she's drunk and can't prove who she is. It definitely makes her seem vulnerable, and it makes you wonder about what the guard did and if he did the right thing.
Yeah. Shouldn't he have been more worried about her, especially since she was clearly drunk and alone?
You'd think so. He was supposed to make sure everyone in the building was safe.
Anyway, Stephen told the police that he saw her slip in and went after her. He said he found her stumbling around, bumping into walls as she walked.
So she sounds pretty intoxicated and disoriented. His claim that he confronted her makes you wonder about his motives, though. Did he want to help her? Or was he trying to manipulate her?
I mean, if he was really concerned, couldn't he have just helped her get to her apartment?
Yeah, maybe. He claims that she decided to go down to the parking garage to see if her keys were in her car.
But she used a keypad to get into her apartment. Her car keys wouldn't have helped her get in. It sounds like she was in no state to be thinking straight.
It does seem that way. That little detail is actually pretty telling. It just reinforces the idea that she was in a vulnerable position, a situation that someone with bad intentions could easily take advantage of.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. So he walks her down to the garage, and she suddenly remembers her code.
Oh, so she does know it.
But then when they get back to her apartment, she can't get the keypad to work.
So she's really struggling. It's back and forth, and she can't remember the code. It paints a picture of someone who is very easy to take advantage of.
And that's when Steven says he had to go do his rounds and left her at her door. He told her if she wasn't inside by the time he got back, they'd figure something out.
Leaving her by herself, especially in her condition, raises some questions about the security guard's judgment. You know, it's a risky decision to prioritize his rounds over the safety of a resident who clearly needed help.
It definitely seems like a red flag. Then he claims that when he came back, she was gone, so he just figured she'd finally gotten inside. But then he mentions that he might have seen her again later, a little after 3 a.m. with a man in the hallway.
So now there's a possible mystery man. The fact that he's not even sure if it was her makes you wonder if he was really paying attention.
He said he didn't get a good look at her, and that she might have been wearing different clothes than before, so he just assumed they both lived in the complex and didn't go up to them.
So again, he doesn't do anything. He just assumes they belong there without actually checking. It seems like another lapse in judgment.
So the police are now looking for this mystery man, hoping he might know something about what happened to Sasha.
So the investigation shifts now. They're trying to find anyone who might have seen her in the hours before her death.
And not long after, 2 women called the police. They said they had seen Sasha stumbling down the street alone on Friday night, and that a car with some guys in it had been trying to get her attention.
That just shows how vulnerable she was being drunk and alone. It's a reminder of how dangerous it can be for people, especially women, to be out by themselves when they're intoxicated.
The women told the police they were worried about her because she was so drunk, so they called an Uber for her to make sure she got home safe.
That was a good thing to do. They saw someone in trouble and took action to help. It shows how being a bystander and intervening can really make a difference.
They said she couldn't even remember the name of her apartment complex, but she knew she lived nearby. And as luck would have it, their Uber stopped at a red light right by her complex. So they got her out and walked her to the door of her building before they left.
So this confirms that she did make it back to her building, and it emphasizes how important it is to look out for each other, especially when someone is vulnerable.
Those women were definitely there at the right time. Unfortunately, though, they didn't know anything else that could help the police. But then a major development occurred. The security footage finally came in.
That changes everything. Now investigators have evidence that can either back up or disprove the stories they've heard.
The first thing they did was review the footage to see if it matched up with Steven's story. Because at this point, he was the last person known to have seen her alive.
They had to make sure his story was accurate. The footage showed Sasha entering the complex at 1:46 a.m. Then, about 20 minutes later, she's running up the stairs with Steven following her.
So far, so good. But the footage didn't show Sasha with any man in the hallway around 3 a.m. like Steven had said.
That doesn't sound good. It raises a red flag and suggests he might be holding back information or changing his story.
So with that lead going nowhere, the investigators started looking for anyone else who might have interacted with Sasha. They found out she was single, but they did track down 2 of her ex-boyfriends, her most recent ex and one she'd been talking to again. Both guys provided alibis and DNA samples.
It makes sense to look into her relationships. Ruling those guys out through alibis and DNA helped them narrow down the suspects.
And their DNA didn't match the DNA found at the crime scene, so they were back to square one. But then they found Sasha's iPad in her apartment, and it showed that someone named Ben had texted her around 5 a.m. that morning.
Now there's a new twist. Who is this Ben, and what was his connection to Sasha?
The texts were weird. Ben invited Sasha to a party and offered to pay for her Uber. She just replied, Ben, and that was it.
That's a strange conversation. Maybe they were using some kind of code or shorthand that we don't understand.
The police were assuming that Sasha was still alive at 5:12 a.m. when she sent that last text.
Well, that's a fair assumption. She sent it from her iPad, but someone else could have sent it.
They looked through the security footage again to see if they could spot this Ben before or after 5 a.m. But they couldn't find him anywhere, and no sign of Sasha either.
Not finding Ben on the footage is a setback. It makes his messages seem less important.
Just when it seemed like they were stuck, they noticed something they hadn't seen before. At 6:36 a.m., they saw Steven leaving the building and go into the second floor of the parking garage. He was carrying 2 trash bags.
That's interesting. Why was he taking out the trash, especially when it wasn't his job?
He came back a few minutes later without the bags, and then left the property at 6:39 a.m., ending his shift. And the weird part is that his shift was supposed to end at 6 a.m. He didn't log any overtime that day, and he's not on camera for over an hour before coming back with those trash bags.
So his schedule and what he was doing don't add up. That missing hour and the trash bags are suspicious.
And when they looked closely at the type of bags he was carrying, they realized they were the same kind that Sasha had in her apartment.
Now that's incriminating. That connects him directly to her apartment. It's like he was in her place, maybe getting rid of evidence.
Of course, the police asked him about it, and his answer, he said he was just being a good Samaritan and taking out some trash that had been left in the hallway.
That explanation doesn't sound very convincing, especially with everything else that's going on.
Not at all. And there's a problem with that story. When the police checked his security logs, he always logged when trash was left in the hallway. He would even write up residents who didn't throw their trash away properly.
So he's usually very careful about trash. Now suddenly he changes his routine on the night of Sasha's murder. It seems like he might be covering his tracks.
And to make things worse, he hadn't logged anything about trash in the hallway that night.
That missing log entry makes his story even less believable.
Yeah.
It looks like he was trying to hide what he was doing.
The police brought Stephen in for another interview. They asked him about the logs and why he didn't log the trash or his overtime. And he just gave vague answers, saying he didn't always log everything and just hadn't logged it that night.
That sounds evasive, like he's hiding something. Not being able to give a clear explanation just makes him look more suspicious.
Then they asked him if he'd ever been in Sasha's apartment, and he replies, "I'm not supposed to go into apartments."
That's not even an answer. He's obviously trying to avoid the question.
Exactly. They ask him again if he had been in her apartment, and he finally says no. Then they ask him to describe the shoes he'd been wearing that night, and he couldn't remember any details. He said he didn't really pay attention to what shoes he was wearing.
Another red flag. Not remembering a simple thing like his shoes makes it seem like he's trying to distance himself from those shoe prints they found at the scene.
The police asked him to get his shoes and bring them to the station, which he does. They compare them to the footprints found in Sasha's apartment, and guess what? They match.
Wow, that's bad news for him. That really hurts his credibility. Matching his shoes to the footprints found in her apartment makes the case against him much stronger.
But even with the matching shoe prints, Stephen kept saying he'd never been in her apartment and definitely didn't kill her. So at this point, they ask him to take a polygraph test. He agrees, and they ask him 4 questions. Did he know if Sasha had been poison shot with a .22 stabbed or choked?
Polygraph tests are good tools for investigations. They measure physical reactions that might show someone is lying.
He answered no to all 4 questions, but one of his answers caused a big reaction on the polygraph. It showed he was nervous. And you can probably guess which question that was.
Given what happened to Sasha, it was probably the question about choking. That would make sense. It suggests that he knows something about the crime that someone who's innocent wouldn't know.
Exactly. It was the question about whether she had been choked. And at that point, only the killer and the police knew she had been strangled.
That polygraph result makes the evidence against him even stronger. His body basically betrayed him and showed he knew about the crime.
So on October 30th, 2015, only 13 days after they found Sasha's body, Stephen Dewberry was arrested and charged with her murder and sexual battery.
So things are moving fast. The police did their work and gathered enough evidence to arrest him.
He said he was not guilty and was held without bail while waiting for his trial. There were several hearings and attempts to suppress evidence, but the trial started 2 years later in November 2017.
2 years isn't unusual for a complicated case like this. Justice can be slow sometimes, especially when the stakes are so high.
And honestly, I was shocked that he wanted a trial. The evidence against him seemed really strong. His initial claim that he had never even been in her apartment really limited his options.
Choosing to go to trial with all that evidence against you is a big risk. Maybe he thought they could find a weakness in the prosecution's case? Or maybe he wanted to control the story in some way?
It's hard to imagine what his defense could be. What could they possibly say to argue against the forensic evidence, the Google searches, and all the things in Stephen's own story that didn't add up?
It's a tough situation for the defense. There's so much incriminating evidence. They might try to question the evidence or shift the focus to Sasha's character, but none of that is likely to work very well.
It seems like a desperate attempt. During the trial, Stephen's lawyers tried to find weaknesses in the prosecution's case, but they weren't very successful. And then they did something really awful. They tried to make Sasha look bad, implying that she slept around, drank too much, and was aggressive sexually.
Sadly, we see that a lot in cases of sexual assault or violence against women. It's a way to blame the victim and make the jury question what happened.
It's infuriating.
Hmm.
It's like they're saying she deserved it because of her lifestyle, which has nothing to do with the fact that she was brutally murdered in her own home.
You're right. A victim's choices should never be used to excuse violence against them. The focus should always be on what the perpetrator did.
This case shows us that blaming the victim is never okay. We need to hold people accountable for their actions.
I completely agree. We have to challenge these harmful ideas and make sure the justice system focuses on the rights and safety of victims.
So it seemed like the defense wasn't about proving Stephen was innocent. It was more about making Sasha look bad. It was a weak strategy, especially compared to what the prosecution presented. They argue that when Sasha got home, Stephen took advantage of her being drunk and alone without her phone. He saw an opportunity to hurt her.
That idea fits with the security footage that shows him following Sasha and then talking to her in the parking garage. It suggests he saw that she was vulnerable and might have already been planning to take advantage of that.
They pointed to the fact that he Googled how to get past keypad locks, which shows he was thinking about doing something like this.
Those Google searches are important. They show he was planning this. He wanted to know how to get past her security system so he could get into her apartment.
And they think that once he was inside, he started to sexually assault her. When she fought back, he beat and strangled her and accidentally crushed her larynx in the process.
That makes sense with the physical evidence, especially the defensive wounds and the severe neck fracture. It points to a violent struggle and an escalation of aggression.
And to cover up what he did, he poured bleach on her to try to destroy any DNA evidence. Then he rolled her body into the comforter.
Using bleach and hiding the body is something someone would do if they knew they'd done something wrong and wanted to avoid getting caught.
After cleaning up and taking out the trash, Stephen went home. The prosecution presented all the evidence and made it clear that he was guilty.
They did a good job of presenting their case and telling the story. It made it really hard to believe that Stephen was innocent.
The trial lasted a little over a week, and the jury only took half a day to decide. Guilty of first-degree murder, attempted sexual battery, and burglary.
Wow, they decided quickly. It seems like the evidence was really convincing, and they didn't believe the defense's attempts to make Sasha look bad.
Stephen was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 15 years. That's a serious sentence, and it shows how terrible his crimes were and the impact it had on the people who love Sasha.
That sentence means he'll be in prison for the rest of his life.
He did try to appeal the verdict in 2019, but it was denied.
So the appeal didn't work. The court looked at the case again and agreed with the jury's decision.
At least there's some comfort knowing that he'll never hurt anyone else. Stephen Dewberry is currently serving his 2 life sentences in a Florida prison. This case is scary. It reminds you that the people we trust to keep us safe can sometimes be the biggest danger. Sasha should have felt safe at home, especially with the security guard there.
It's a scary thought, for sure. It makes you think. We often talk about stranger danger, but sometimes the danger is closer than we think. People in positions of authority, people we think are there to protect us.
It's not just about physical safety either. It's also about feeling safe emotionally, about trusting the people in our lives.
That's true. Betraying someone's trust can be really damaging to individuals and communities. It can make us feel less secure and question our own judgment.
The Crime Junkie hosts mentioned something that stuck with me. They talk about how Stephen was able to Google how to defeat a keypad lock and use that to break into Sasha's apartment. It's unsettling that information like that is so easy to find.
It is unsettling. The internet has so much information, which is usually a good thing. But there's a dark side, too. And in this case, it gave the killer the knowledge he needed to get past the security system.
It makes you think about how many other systems are vulnerable to that kind of thing.
It's a good question. We rely on technology more and more for security, but that creates new vulnerabilities that we need to think about. It shows how important it is to have strong security systems, but also to understand their weaknesses and have other safeguards in place.
So what can people do to protect themselves, especially if they live in apartments with those keypad entry systems?
Don't just rely on the keypad. Have something else too, like a chain lock or a deadbolt. That adds another layer of protection.
And it probably makes people think twice about trying to break in.
Exactly. You could also get a security system. There are a lot of affordable ones out there that are easy to use and made for apartments.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
It's reassuring that we can do things to be safer. Another thing that's pretty amazing is that the police got data from Stephen's phone even after he'd done a factory reset. It makes you think that deleting something doesn't always mean it's gone.
That's so true. Our digital footprint can last a long time. Even if you delete something, it can be found again with the right tools and expertise.
It's a reminder to be careful about what we do online. Anyway, back to the trial. Stephen's defense team tried to make Sasha look bad.
Yeah, that's a common tactic in these kinds of cases, trying to shift the blame onto the victim and take the focus away from the perpetrator.
But the evidence against Stephen was just too strong. The matching shoe prints, the DNA evidence, the Google searches, the inconsistent statements, it all pointed to him.
The prosecution did a good job, and the jury could see through the defense's attempts to make Sasha look bad. They focused on the facts.
And thankfully, justice was served. Stephen is still behind bars. It's a small comfort, I guess, knowing that Sasha's family and friends got some justice. But it doesn't erase the tragedy or the fact that someone who was supposed to protect people did something so horrible.
It's a sad reminder that we have to be careful and aware of our safety and the safety of people we care about. Bad things can happen even when you don't expect them.
So as we finish our deep dive into the Sasha Samsidine case, what's the most important thing you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the main thing is that we can't control everything, but we can be smarter by being informed, aware, and proactive. We can take steps to be safer, trust our instincts, and speak up if something seems off. We can all work together to create a safer world.
That's a great point. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, as always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back next week with another case, another story, and another chance to learn more about the world around us. Make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss an episode.